Today, most video game companies use emulation in some form, but before emulation went mainstream, it had a seedy reputation. It existed in a legal gray area and was hardly mentioned by video game news outlets. It was relegated to the video game underworld. But as more and more people bought personal computers, video game emulators enjoyed a small but growing fan base. To put it simply, emulation uses software to mimic hardware. So, for example, gamers could play Super Mario Bros. On their computer without owning a Nintendo Entertainment System. Early emulation software was glitchy, but it was free, and it exposed people all across the world to new games. North American gamers played titles never released in their continent, fully translated. Players also got an inside look at how much games changed during the localization process, especially the Nintendo titles. But was it all legal? Well, people weren't sure, but they weren't sure if it was illegal either. News and updates came via message boards, chat rooms, or just word of mouth. In 1994, a new beast entered the industry, the Sony PlayStation. The PlayStation was Sony's first video game console, and it was one of the most technologically advanced on the market. By 1997, PlayStation emulators began appearing on the internet in the form of PS Emu and Psych. However, these emulators didn't stack up well against the PlayStation. They suffered from compatibility issues and were updated infrequently. Sony wasn't worried at all. The average video game player didn't even know about emulators. Sony figured emulation was too niche and complex for the average consumer. But that all changed in 1999 when two companies developed PlayStation emulators for commercial release. Bleem and the Connectix Virtual Game Station stood out from the crowd. They were ready for prime time, and they weren't free. Suddenly, Sony didn't feel so safe and took both companies to court. Bleem and Connectix took Sony head on, and surprisingly, they won. But it was a classic case of money is power. In the end, Sony's persistent litigation and clever tactics ultimately killed both products. But their fight changed emulation forever and brought it out from the shadows of video game culture. We begin with a look at the Connectix Virtual Game Station. In the world of Macintosh, the Connectix company was a rule breaker. Formed in 1988, Connectix was best known for their virtual PC software, which allowed Windows to run on a Mac. In 1998, programmer Aaron Giles joined the company. He worked previously on Mac ports of various titles for LucasArts, but his passion was emulation. On the side, Giles spent up to 20 hours a week working on an arcade emulator called MAME. He felt right at home on Connectix's virtual PC team. One day over lunch, Giles mentioned that he'd recently discovered a batch of PlayStation emulators, including PS Emu Pro. It got him thinking about creating a PlayStation emulator for the Macintosh. Management at Connectix was on board. A successful emulator could be a huge moneymaker. At the time, the Macintosh game market was pretty dry. This could blow it up. During development, Giles stumbled across an online document that explained the operations of the PlayStation's coprocessor. He also found a copy of the PlayStation BIOS floating around. Connectix had a working prototype within a few weeks. The emulator could boot up to the PlayStation logo and ask for a game. It was groundbreaking. No company had ever attempted a commercial video game console emulator. But if Connectix wanted to make the product, they had to do it legitimately. They set up a meeting with Sony in hopes of licensing the PlayStation BIOS. During the meeting, Connectix showed the emulator running the most popular game at the time, Crash Bandicoot. A Sony executive then asked if the software could run any game. Of course, Giles said. But that stretched the truth. His team hadn't verified the compatibility of every PlayStation game. The Sony executive put him to the test when he plucked a random title from a bookcase that contained hundreds of North American PlayStation games. Luckily for Connectix, it was Ridge Racer, one of the few titles that worked on the emulator. The meeting seemed to go well, but Sony had an unsettling poker face. Connectix left Sony headquarters with bad vibes. In October of 1998, they received the news. Sony would not allow them to use their BIOS. But that didn't stop Connectix. Their solution? Eliminate the BIOS entirely. Giles and his team analyzed the functions of the PlayStation BIOS and rewrote it using C code. Their version was even faster than emulating the original PlayStation BIOS. Connectix hoped they were in the clear. At the Macworld Expo in January of 1999, Steve Jobs unveiled the Connectix Virtual Game Station.
Now, this is another game machine. It's the most popular game machine in the world. Wouldn't it be great if we could play some of those titles too? Well, at Macworld today, Connectix is introducing the Virtual Game Station. It is software.
The Virtual Game Station boasted no graphical improvements, but it had the best compatibility of any PlayStation emulator. They regularly released compatibility updates, and they were careful to not step on Sony's toes. The software could only play games using the original disc, and was region-locked. However, modders released patches to circumvent these restrictions. The Virtual Game Station was a hit. Priced at $49.99, more than 3,000 copies sold during the Macworld Expo, one every 30 seconds. But during the expo, several members of Sony's legal team hovered around the Connectix booth. 3 weeks later, Sony sued Connectix for a total of 9 claims, including copyright infringement, patent infringement, and trademark dilution. But Connectix didn't scare easily. They fought the case and even started work on a Windows version of the emulator. The trial was scheduled for the following year, but with virtual game stations flying off the shelves, Sony was in no mood to sit around. They applied for a temporary restraining order, but on February 5, 1999, they were denied. It was an early victory for Connectix. The Virtual Game Station remained on store shelves, where it had grossed more than $3 million. But the war was not over. Meanwhile, Giles and his co-workers were deposed. They were asked about their reverse engineering efforts and the source of the various documents that contained information about Sony's processors. Just 2 months later, on April 22nd, a judge granted Sony a preliminary injunction against Connectix. Judge Charles Legg thought that when Connectix reverse engineered the PlayStation BIOS, it was not fair use. He also felt that the Virtual Game Station tarnished the Sony PlayStation brand. Therefore, the case had merit, and a preliminary injunction was warranted. The preliminary injunction halted any further shipments of the Virtual Game Station to stores. It was a huge blow to Connectix. They appealed almost immediately. Any momentum Connectix had was destroyed. With the product disappearing from stores, users turned elsewhere. The software became the victim of rampant piracy. But on February 10, 2000, an appellate court decision changed not only the outcome of this case, but determined the legality of emulation. Judge William Canby Jr. ruled that the methods Connectix used to reverse engineer the PlayStation were necessary to gain access to unprotected functional elements within the system. Connectix didn't copy any of Sony's code either. Therefore, Connectix's reverse engineering of the PlayStation BIOS fell under fair use. Judge Canby also reversed the decision on tarnishment of the Sony brand. In order to prevail on its tarnishment claim, Sony had to prove that the Virtual Game Station's existence brought about a negative association with the PlayStation. Judge Canby found that there was insufficient evidence for this claim. Connectix was allowed to sell the Virtual Game Station again, and even launch the Windows version. Major video game websites picked up the appellate court's ruling. Emulation was no longer an underground phenomenon. The ruling legitimized hardware emulation and found that reverse engineering video game consoles was fair use. 3 months later, Connectix received even more good news. Judge Charles Legg, the man who originally granted the preliminary injunction against Connectix, dismissed 7 of Sony's 9 claims. Sony hoped to take their last 2 claims of unfair competition and violation of trade secrets to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court refused to hear the case. Down but not out, Sony took a new tactic. In March of 2001, Sony acquired Connectix's Virtual Game Station technology for an undisclosed amount. Connectix gave them their software, all the hardware they used in development, and deleted everything from their servers. And Sony discontinued the product. In the end, it worked out well for Connectix. By 2001, sales of Virtual Game Station had basically halted thanks to its hiatus from the market and the much-anticipated launch of the PlayStation 2. From a business perspective, selling the Virtual Game Station was the best outcome. After the sale, Aaron Giles was reassigned to work on the Connectix Virtual PC application. In 2003, the product and its staff was purchased by Microsoft, where Giles continues to work to this day. He says he's proud of the product and that developing the Virtual Game Station was the most enjoyable 6 months of his career. While the legal battle left a bad taste in his mouth, he does like to imagine that Sony used some of the Virtual Game Station technology in their future products. But that remains a mystery. Connectix's battle against Sony set a huge precedent for the legality of emulation. But no company brought emulation into the mainstream more than Bleem. Let's take a look. In late 1998, screenshots circulated of a new PlayStation emulator in closed beta. It not only played PlayStation games, it enhanced them. It was known simply as Bleem, and it was created by veteran programmer Randy Linden. Linden had experience in video games and emulation. In 1988, he wrote a Commodore 64 emulator for the Amiga computer. Later, he ported Dragon's Lair to the Amiga, as well as Doom to the Super Nintendo. What did Bleem stand for? That remains a mystery, but many refer to it as the best little emulator ever made. Bleem seemed too good to be true. Some thought Linden faked the leaked screenshots. The system requirements seemed optimistically low. Bleem needed a Pentium 166 MHz processor, which was more than 2 years old at the time, only 16 megabytes of RAM, and just 3 megabytes of disk space. Incredibly, Linden promised hardware acceleration capabilities. Bleem took advantage of a computer's video card to increase the resolution of a game, smooth out textures, and more. But when the Bleem beta leaked in January of 1999, the doubters were silenced. It spread like wildfire. Users were amazed at how well it emulated the PlayStation. Word spread that Bleem would soon become a commercial product. On March 21st, they released a Bleem demo. They also opened up pre-orders on their website. Bleem suddenly seemed more and more legitimate. In an interview with IGN, Bleem president David Herpolsheimer was asked if he anticipated any legal trouble from Sony, who had recently taken Connectix to court for the Virtual Game Station. Herpolsheimer confidently said no. For starters, Bleem was programmed legally. Linden had completely reverse-engineered the PlayStation in order to make Bleem. The software also required the actual retail discs in order to play games, so Bleem didn't promote piracy. Herpolsheimer also claimed Bleem only worked with, quote, about 80% of the PlayStation library. But none of this saved Bleem from Sony. On April 2nd, less than 2 weeks after pre-orders opened, Sony filed suit against Bleem for a variety of claims, including violation of intellectual property and copyright infringement. This happened in conjunction with Sony's case against Connectix. But unlike Connectix, Bleem was a brand new startup company with only a handful of employees. No one believed they could put up a fight against the Sony juggernaut. Despite the David and Goliath dynamics, many in the industry sided with Sony. Gary Whitta of PC Gamer said, "No one seriously thinks Bleem is going to get in Sony's way. The concern is if PC gaming becomes more popular and emulators become better technologically. If I was Sony, I'd probably release the hounds." But Bleem surprised everyone when they didn't back down. In April, Sony attempted twice to get a temporary restraining order to prevent Bleem's release. They were denied both times. Tensions reached a boiling point the following month, when Bleem suddenly released their product at the E3 Expo. At their booth, they showed off footage of Gran Turismo on their emulator. Sony confronted them and a shouting match ensued. The Expo asked Bleem to remove their monitors from the floor. But this was a minor setback. Within the first month, Bleem sold more than 50,000 copies, at a retail price of $29.99. By July, it was in stores like Best Buy, Electronics Boutique, Barnes & Noble, and Fry's. The following month, they received even more good news. Judge Charles Legg denied Sony's request for a preliminary injunction against Bleem. He did, however, state that Bleem could not use screenshots of PlayStation games in their advertising. Bleem quickly appealed that decision. In December, Bleem struck back. They countersued Sony for anti-competitive practices and misuse of intellectual property. They also began work on a new version of Bleem that would run on Sega's newest console, the Dreamcast. On May 4th of 2000, Bleem emerged victorious again. An appeals court overturned the district court's earlier decision that Bleem could not use screenshots of PlayStation games in their advertising. Judge O'Scanlan ruled that Bleem was using comparative advertising, which, as long as it isn't untruthful or deceptive, is a source of important information to consumers and therefore considered fair use. If sales of Sony consoles drop, it will be due to the Bleem emulator's technical superiority over the PlayStation console, not because Bleem used screenshots to illustrate that comparison, he wrote. The following week, on May 11th, Bleem announced Bleem for Dreamcast. Game compatibility would be distributed via packs. Each pack would be compatible with up to 100 games and retail for $19.99. Games would run at a 640 by 480 resolution with anti-aliasing and bilinear filtering. Bleem even hinted at releasing an accessory called a Bleem Pod, a PS1 to Dreamcast controller converter. But once again, Sony pounced. The next week, on May 19th, they sued Bleem again, this time for patent infringement. By 2001, sales of Bleem had slowed down tremendously. A wave of development issues as well as constant litigation from Sony delayed Bleem for Dreamcast. Consumers wouldn't see the product until the summer of 2001, and it was a disappointment. It was renamed Bleemcast, and game compatibility was released individually rather than in packs. Only 3 discs were released: Gran Turismo 2, Metal Gear Solid, and Tekken 3. Sony was losing in court, but that didn't stop them from throwing their weight around. After the Bleemcast's release, Sony called retailers and threatened to take legal action or halt stock of Sony products if they carried Bleemcast. One store, Babbage's, asked to return its order of 7,000 copies of Bleemcast. It was a huge blow to Bleem. By November of 2001, with sales declining and further litigation on the horizon, Bleem officially shut down. After the shutdown, its website featured a Bleem gravestone with Sonic standing over it. Ironically enough, they removed the image to prevent any legal action from Sega. One of the most common questions about these two cases is, why did Sony care so much? The answer is licensing fees, which is one of the biggest moneymakers for a console manufacturer. If the virtual game station in Bleem took off, developers could make PlayStation games without going through Sony, thereby avoiding a licensing fee. While Sony didn't win the legal battles against either company, their strategy of constant litigation won in the end. In the years that followed, emulation was somewhat embraced by the major video game console manufacturers. Nintendo's Virtual Console allows users to download and play hundreds of old titles, and Sony has offered PlayStation 1 and 2 games on their PlayStation Network. When Sony came after Connectix and Bleem, neither company backed down. They paid a hefty price for their courage. Today, both products can be found laying around thrift stores for a measly $1. But their legacy lives on in the form of legal precedent. And thanks to their battles, emulation has emerged from the shadows of video game culture. That's all for this episode of Gaming Historian. Thanks for watching.
Funding for Gaming Historian is provided in part by supporters on Patreon. Thank you.